Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Hey, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I am pleased to be joined today by Reverend Mark Elsdon. Hey.
Hi there.
Hey, thanks for being here. Want to read you Mark's bio. He lives and works at the intersection of money and meaning as an entrepreneur, pastor, consultant, and speaker. He's the co-founder of RootedGood, which seeks to create more good in the world through social innovation. He's the executive director at Press House on the University of Wisconsin's Madison campus and owner of Elsdon Strategic Consulting. He's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA and lives in Madison, Wisconsin with his spouse and two daughters. He's an avid cyclist and considers it a good year when he rides more miles on his bike than he drives on his car. And we'll be talking about his book here shortly. He's actually donating 100% of the proceeds, author proceeds, from the sale of the book to nonprofit organizations, which is pretty cool. So for our listeners, I'm getting over a head cold, so going to struggle extra more than usual with words and pronunciation today. But Mark, thanks for being here. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
I think you covered it well. I guess you can know that it's below zero here in Madison, so not able to ride outside a whole lot right now, doing a bit of skiing and riding my bike indoors. But glad to be here and glad to talk about some of these important subjects.
Well, the important subject I was going to ask about was how much you were riding your bike in the cold. Here in the Denver metro area, it's 7 degrees today, high of 7. And I wondered how much, even as an avid cycler, you go out. Because I don't know what the word is for like a aspiring cyclist, I guess you might say. And about 40 degrees, 45 is about all I can handle.
They do say that it's really all about the clothing. And if you have the right clothing, you can do just about anything. And to some extent, that's true. Although I will say below zero is sort of my limit.
Yeah.
It just gets pretty hard to stay warm no matter what you're wearing, especially when you're moving. But
Yeah. I remember I used to run a lot, and runners, they used to say, dress as if it's 20 degrees warmer than it is. So if it's like 40, dress like as if it's 60. For me, it's like I hate being cold, so even when I was running, I would dress warm, and when I was biking, when it was less cold out, I'd still overdress because I do not like being cold. But
yep.
Well, this is not a biking podcast, so we'll move on. But talk about your journey of faith, what it's meant to be a Christian in the past, and what it looked like today, if anything's changed, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I grew up in a Christian home, going to church since I was born, baptized in a Lutheran church, and have had a journey of various denominations throughout the years. I think broadly that question of sort of what is faith mean today, and has it changed? That's a huge question. You could study for your lifetime, but
yeah,
one of the reflections I would have is that I think, at least in American Christianity, for a long time, the Christian faith was associated with what you believe in your head, what you think about something. And to me, that one of the shifts that is happening, and it may actually be more of a return to the ancient than it is something new, is a move towards living the Christian life rather than believing a Christian idea. And I think that's all throughout my book. It's all throughout sort of my ministry. It's throughout my own life, my own practice. but this idea that we experience God through how we live and through our through the things that we do as much as we do through what we say we believe or what we think in our head. And I think for me, even as the older I've gotten, the more that has proven to be the case.
Yeah, awesome. Talk about a spiritual practice you've been meaningful to you or you might recommend to others.
Well, we started the podcast with one. That's riding my bike.
Yeah, there you go.
But
yeah.
I will say, actually, this year, this COVID year that we've been in, there's been two things that come to my mind. One is that idea of taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
And for me, that is very much a physical thing, exercise, being out on my bike, having time to decompress, making a commitment to that every day, regardless of how busy the day is. In the dead of winter here, I've taken to going out on my skis, cross-country skiing for an hour or so in the middle of the day while there's still some
cool.
light.
Yeah.
Which is good, yeah. And just making sure that is part of the everyday routine, and I experience God in the deepest ways out on my rides and out in nature and just out physically moving. The other practice that I think was interesting for me this year in particular was being led by African American leaders in our community in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Showing up with my family at Black Lives Matter protests and prayerful protests that were really powerful here in Madison and happened all over the country. And again, that's sort of an example of that living it out, sort of letting the faith be experienced in the middle of what we do and showing up, not just thinking about it, not just talking about justice, but actually being present in it, and in particular with this issue, as a white man, being led and letting myself be led by others that know much more and have much more to teach me, and so that's been a particularly meaningful experience this year.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting how you're kind of on this theme of living out or getting away from a head. I don't know, a head. I can't think and talk today, but. Faith that's all in your head and more of a lived out faith. Because that's essentially what you're saying too with your spiritual practices. It's like it's a lived out faith rather than just like the traditional, I'm just going to sit and read my Bible and study the scriptures. I'm going to find other ways to live out or embody my spirituality.
Right. I'm a Presbyterian minister. We love reading things. So, I don't have a problem with that. It's just, I think that for me at least, and I think for many people, if it doesn't connect with what's happening in our world and what's happening around us, then it's sort of like, what's the point? And when I do read the Bible, I read of a God that entered the world, the world, the fullness of that world. And so, to me, that's just a big place where that's experienced and where that's found.
I also just want to point out Mark's emphasis on taking care of himself. I've been kind of gotten that lesson recently from my spiritual director, and trying to. I was going to tell our listeners, we have special guests today. Okay, ask your sister. We'll have special guests today in and out of the podcast. So, folks, if you could be understanding of that. I was reading actually in a business book, Mark, about the importance of Sabbath.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important. Yeah.
Mark is the author of We Aren't Broke, Uncovering Hidden Resources for Mission and Ministry. And as we're recording, this is February. The book is coming out in June. Is that correct?
Correct, June 1st.
Okay, so not positive when this will air, but I think it'll be right around either before, a little before that or shortly right around that time. But talk to us about what prompted the book. And I think, I'm guessing part of the story of Press House fits in there. So tell us a little bit about that too.
Yeah, so one of my roles for the past almost 17 years has been as a pastor and executive director at Press House, the Presbyterian affiliated campus ministry center at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. My wife and I were called there in 2004 to revitalize the campus ministry. There were 0 students, a building falling apart around us, and just a struggling situation, but we had a lot of promise and potential and history. And one of the things that happened in the first few years is that we designed and built a student apartment community that housed about 250 students on our parking lot next to a historic church. And I talk about this in the book, and there's a great deal about that story that can be unpacked. But what led to this book in part was that we built that project in 2006 and 7, just before the financial crisis of 2008. Mm-hmm. We were able to borrow financing funds to build this project. It was a $17 million project. And 5 years later, when we went to refinance, which is typical in commercial real estate like this, we found ourselves in a very different financing environment than we had been in 2007 after the crisis of 2008. So what that meant was that, like many people around the country, on paper, we were sort of underwater, you might say. We no problem actually filling the building at that point, no problem paying our bills, but the value of apartment real estate had dropped simply on paper. So we were short about $2.5 million in financing dollars, basically. And I had a lot of sleepless nights trying to figure out what the heck we were going to do to keep this thing open. Again, it was working just fine. The debt service was fine. All of the financial elements of it were fine, at least at that time. But we just simply needed more cash in the deal, or more lending from some other partner besides the one we started with. So what that meant was we went and eventually I worked with our synod, the Synod of Lakes and Prairies, the upper Midwest region of the United States, Presbyterian Synod. Took about a year of working with them to develop a partnership whereby they took a quarter of their endowed assets, their invested assets, out of traditional stock and bond investments, and actually diversified from those investments into real estate, Presbyterian real estate, real estate at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, essentially our project. So they took 2.5 of a roughly $10 million fund and placed it with us in the form of a loan in the end. And we pay a return on that money. So we pay the synod back a financial return, which they then use to do their programming. So it's a win-win-win for everyone. We get access to capital. We were able to secure the rest of our financing as a result of that capital. We've served thousands of students because of that. We generate more than $2 million a year in revenue through our project. And then they actually take the proceeds that we're paying and use it for their ministry and programming, which is just an incredible model. And so, a couple of years after we did that, I started to ask myself, why are we not doing this all over the place? We've got literally billions of dollars of invested assets and property in the Presbyterian Church alone, but never mind all of the denominations. We could be moving some of that money into play and into social enterprises and into mission-oriented ministry projects more directly. Why are we borrowing from banks when we have all that money even within our own family, so to speak, the faith family? And so that led me to do an MBA and to then move into exploring impact investing, and ultimately led to the writing of this book.
Awesome. I met Mark after I started, but I started an MBA. It's been about a year ago, Mark, I think of like today, I'll be like unofficially halfway through,
Nice.
which
Well
is
done.
fun.
Yeah, that is.
But it was fun just to come across Mark as someone, a pastor who's also gone, or in your case, finished an MBA. So I really enjoyed kind of getting to know Mark. Certainly reading his book. Now, as I read the book, Mark, kind of one of the broader themes in the book was this idea that there's this we don't think of it like this in mainline Protestant circles, but your kind of broader point is that there really are like piles of cash. Maybe that's too broad, but it seems like your point is that there's lots of assets in churches that we're missing. So, like, what's your first suggestion, step for churches to begin to kind of uncover or stop missing these resources?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's at least two things happening that lead to that. So there are, just as a point of reference, in the consortium of religious organizations that are part of the a consortium of investor advocates, there's $400 billion of assets under management owned by religious organizations around the world.
Wow.
And that's Christian, mostly Christian. If you actually expand it beyond that, it's multiple trillions of dollars if you include other faiths. So there's huge sums of money owned and invested by religious entities, and it's almost all invested very traditionally, placed in traditional investments where earnings are then taken out. So invested in Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, also other, all sorts of things, companies basically, and then the earnings are then taken to do mission and ministry, hopefully. But there is a way in which that money could be put to use differently. I think what's holding us back sometimes is two things. One, it's a narrow understanding of what invested assets and property can be used for. And so we sort of buy in automatically to this idea that the point of investing is to generate the highest financial return at the lowest risk possible. And to just make as much money on our invested assets as we can, period. That's sort of the investing mantra. Which I guess I would say why is God's money that we have sort of on loan to us to use in this time, why is that the purpose? How is that the highest and best use of that money necessarily? If we're trying to do something greater with our money than simply just make money. Similarly with churches, we sort of have this very traditional understanding that church is for an hour-long Sunday morning service and associated programs. Again, there's a lot of other things church buildings can be used for that are ministry. The other thing that I think is happening is fear. There's a great deal of fear about doing things differently, doing social entrepreneurship, social enterprise, or investing differently can be in some ways riskier. It can require a different level of innovation and creativity, and it's easier and it feels safer to just sock it away, to just to put it in. Like the rich fool, I write about this in the book, the parable of the rich fool that loves to just accumulate the extra grain that he came across, that the land produced for him, so he can save it for some other future day. And we sort of operate that way in the church. The interesting thing is there isn't going to be a future day if we keep operating that way, I think, in many parts of the church. So we're saving it for what? I don't know, actually. I don't really know what we're saving it for, other than its own sake sometimes. And so, but fear is a big driver of that. And I get that. I mean, I think it's just even in our own lives, personally, we're managing money, there's a lot of fear. There's a fear there's never not going to be enough. There's a fear of what, might there not be enough? And in some cases that fear is somewhat founded, but the reality is in much of the church, not all, but much, there is a lot there. There's just a lot there in terms of property and assets, a lot more than we maybe imagine initially.
Yeah. So another theme that I maybe I read into, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, that I picked up throughout the book, is a question, I guess, of ecclesiology, to use a big word. And so the question comes out in this, like, do we need to redefine what we mean by church? Because you just kind of alluded to it prior in your answer about kind of church doesn't just have to be about Sunday morning. So I guess maybe this is a two-part question. Like, do we need to redefine church, or, well, what is church? And do we need to redefine it if it's not what we commonly think it is?
Yeah, I mean, this is another, one of these huge questions you can spend your life talking about. But it is one that the pandemic has actually brought to, I think, a real head. What is church when we don't even actually go to the building for a year? What is church when worship happens over Zoom or Facebook Live and not in a sanctuary? Just some of these questions are, really have been raised in a powerful way, actually, as a result of the pandemic. And it is my hope that we will not miss that opportunity to think differently with what we've learned through this time that's been such a difficult time. But I guess I would say I do think that mission and ministry, at least, are certainly not limited to Sunday morning. And let me give you an example from Press House. So we do worship every Sunday at Press House. And prior to COVID, we did a full worship service in a chapel with communion every week, preaching and songs and all that. It's, of course, looks different during COVID, but we do a Sunday worship service with students. It's vital. It's a big part of our ministry. But it's just a couple hours on a Sunday. We have 240 students that live in our apartment building their entire week, day and night, other than when they're out at class. And that we have an opportunity to serve them in a vastly different way than we do with people that come on a Sunday for a service.
Yeah.
An example is we have a program for residents who are experiencing recovery from addiction, heroin addiction or alcohol addiction or other drug addiction. And that program has dramatically transformed the lives of the students that are in that program. It has kept students in school that otherwise would not have made it through school. It has saved the state of Wisconsin more than $500,000 in relapse-related costs. It is a truly transformative program, and it has nothing to do with Sunday morning, or in our case, Sunday evening worship. Directly, right? But we view that as integral part of our mission and our ministry, and perhaps in a broader sense, church. I mean, what did Jesus do? Jesus healed people. Jesus fed people. Jesus met with people where they were at and brought good news to their life. If they were blind, if they were hungry, if they were sick, if they were addicts, if they were whatnot, that's church. I think that is ministry. And so there's a way in which some of the things that the church can do, and then sometimes through social enterprise like a housing facility or something else, can be really dramatically transformative for the lives of the people touched and the community that they live in.
Yeah. One question I'd have is I wonder, can it, like, what's the challenge, maybe, if that's the right word, of like, is it possible to like spread yourself thin, or like kind of like, I don't know if this is the right way of saying it, but kind of go beyond your scope of practice, if you will. Like I've heard it said this way, like, the church doesn't need to be all things to all people. Like, you can work with other nonprofits. So how do you recommend, like, churches balancing, like, knowing what their mission is and their role as a church, but and conversely, like, not trying to do everything?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. There are many things that other people do better than the church could or would do. and there's no need to reinvent all of that if someone else can do it better. What I will say is that I think church communities, there are certain things church communities do very, very well. And they're transferable skills, you might say, transferable value added gifts to a community. And it depends somewhat on who is in the church, who is in a particular congregation. The RootedGood, the other organization I work with and I'm helping to found, we offer an accelerator course for congregations to figure out what to do with their buildings and their property. We call it the Oikos Accelerator. And churches are invited to participate in that. And one of the things that we do is try to help them understand what their needs are in their community, and then match that with what their gifts are within their congregation, both as individual members as well as the larger congregation. Congregations often have a culture or a thing that they're known for, a thing that they're good at. And many times that can be aligned with what the needs are in a community, and they can offer them in new, different ways. Another example at Press House, we recently launched a wellness initiative we call Candid for students on campus. We were hearing increasingly students were in desperate need of mental health and wellness support. And that's a proven, documented, researched reality. Yeah. We explored for a while doing a Christian counseling center or some sort of interfaith counseling center or some other one-on-one sort of services. And we determined that is actually an example of what you described, not in our wheelhouse, really. Now, we could have partnered. We could maybe have hired for that. But what we found was that what we're good at is community. And what students really wanted from us was a place to come in small groups to talk together about the therapy that they may be getting somewhere else, or about the wellness issues that they were dealing with. Yeah. So rather than hire a therapist to do therapy one-on-one, what they really needed from us was our gift and skill, which was bringing people together in community. And so for us, wellness and community is what we offer through Candid, as opposed to sort of personal, just one-on-one wellness. They're all related, of course, but that's our niche. That's what we can offer. And we can take what churches are really good at and then move into a space that churches aren't even showing up in necessarily, at least not in our campus. And so we now offer Candid circles for students to be in wellness groups together, basically, in a way that is just not happening in any other way. And we can use therefore our skill and our gift and marry it to the needs around us and contribute something really meaningful.
That's awesome. It leads me to a more finer question, because throughout the book and kind of in these conversations, you talk about leveraging property and selling property and stuff like that for ministry. And this is kind of a selfish question, so I'll just frame it as a church planter who's invested in new churches. I wonder, from my perspective, again, this is coming from me as a church planter, I get annoyed when church buildings get sold and the money goes to nonprofits, because I think like nonprofits have broader avenues to receive revenue than churches traditionally have, at least in today's context. So I guess A, am I misunderstanding it, that take, and B, like, tell me if I'm wrong, I guess.
I mean, I think the fundamental question is, in any church property, is what can it be used for that really furthers the mission of that church or of the sort of church at large, right? And the answer to that question is not simple. It could be a whole slew of things. It could be selling it in order to generate some revenue for some other use. It could be offering up to a different community to use. It could be launching a church plant within a building that is being turned around into, it could be it's offering it to a different denomination. It could be offering it to a Muslim community to have a place to worship in where they don't in town. There's lots of ways in which it could be used. It could be, of course, used for some sort of social enterprise. It could be redeveloped as a co-working space. It could be turned into a grocery co-op. It could be It could become housing. It could become senior housing, student housing, affordable housing. The options are sort of endless. The question is, how do you align the aims of the property, or the possible uses of the property with the core mission of the organization, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess I wouldn't say it's one or the other. I think it could be both, and it could be. It could be that its best use is to turn it over to a nonprofit or to sell it and pass on the funds to a nonprofit. But I also could be that a partnership could be developed and that the church itself could be a part of that. Or so I guess the options are quite numerous. And I think your caution, I guess, about just selling things, I think, is a valid one. One of my concerns is in the next decade, we're going to see a massive sale of church buildings. Or at least a massive repurposing of church buildings. And I worry that they will end up either simply being sold off because we just don't know what to do with them to the highest bidder, or redeveloped for the most money, neither of which is necessarily a particularly faithful or fruitful use of property that in many cases has existed for decades and upon decades in prime location.
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely like I can't think today, but as a church planner, that's where my aim, where I center around is like, I'm biased. Like I want more resources to go to new churches, but all what you say is great. And it kind of speaks to like, just don't be like haphazard with resources.
Absolutely.
Like think about what you're doing. And like, if I'm hearing you right, it's like, even if you're going to sell a building and donate for a nonprofit, like make sure it's extending the ministry of that church in some way, right?
Yes, absolutely. We at Press House are a really interesting case because around the late 1990s, three campus ministries were under question: the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Presbyterian campus ministries. So in Madison, at Iowa, the University of Iowa, and at the University of Minnesota.
Okay.
The University of Minnesota and the University of Iowa, those properties were sold, and the funds, the proceeds were put into a fund to fund campus ministry sort of broadly. In Wisconsin, in Madison, the local Presbyterians said, "No way, we're not going to let you sell this." There were a lot of active alumni in the area still, and there was a huge internal church fight over our property. And fortunately, those that said no way won, and we ended up holding on to it, which allowed us to do the redevelopment. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be talking, you and I would have, this book would never been written. I would never have done any of this stuff at Press House if that property had been sold. What's interesting is today, there's no really vibrant Presbyterian campus ministry at either of those campuses, and no properties there. And the money is mostly gone from those funds.
Yeah.
And now in Madison, we're serving, over 800 students a year, thousands of students over, a 5-year period. Our property's worth $25 million probably, and we generate $2.5 million of revenue every year. The disparity in outcome couldn't be more stark between what happened in those different settings. Again, I'm not saying that you always don't sell or you just never sell. That's not realistic. That's not necessary. But the difference in what happened as a result of what we did with the property in Madison versus what happened in those other settings is just enormously stark.
And I'll say this, Mark, from my perspective, it seems like too many churches see like selling their building as their I don't know, the word's not Hail Mary, because they see it as this automatic revitalization tool that like, hey, we're going to sell our building, we're going to have all this money, we're going to like revitalize our ministry. And I mean, I'm sure there's examples of it happening where it works out, but I was also reminded, I think it was a year or two ago, somebody called me who I knew, who was a pastor here in Colorado and moved to like the Northeast, and his church had sold their building. And like they'd been meeting in a school for like 3 months, and they called me. It's like, hey, we're looking for a building again.
Interesting, right? And once you sell it, you're never getting it back. I mean, that's the other thing.
And for listeners who want to know anything about mobile church, I can tell you all the horror stories. So just call me or email me later after this is listened to.
Another version of this question is an example too here in Madison, where we had a church that we sold, our Presbyterian, a number of years ago, in a pretty good location in Madison. The church's time was done, and that's fine, and it was celebrated, and that's part of life, is also death,
Yep.
and there's nothing wrong with that at all, and it was good to have its time in that past. And we sold the building to a Muslim community, actually, which was also great and wonderful, and they had now a place to worship. But what we didn't do was do anything intentional with the funds. And so the money, it was about $1 million total, was all broken up into small grants and distributed out around the town. I can't complain too much. As a press house, we received some of that money as sort of a mission partner, and we put it to good use. There's no question we put it to good use, and I'm sure all of the other partners who received money put it to good use. However, it's all gone. And had we kept that $1 million and created a revolving loan fund, for example, we could have used that as seed money to launch affordable housing project, perhaps build a housing project on the property of another church in town, which has extra land, using funds from the closed church. And then it becomes a recycled, growing pool of money to continue to do things with that.
Well, Mark, you're setting me up here. You're like setting me up for this T-ball question that I have to ask you now. So like I'm going to set you up now since you set me up. So you're talking about impact investing, which you talk about in your book. And I think the first thing to say is like money gets spent. Like that was one of my good friends. I remember I got my first ministry job and I was like, oh my goodness, look how much money I'm making. And she's like, you'll spend it. Don't worry. But talk about impact investing and how, talk about, I mean, you're kind of explaining already in your answer there, but talk more about impact investing and how denominations should look more into that.
Yeah, so I think I alluded to this at the beginning of our conversation. Most church entities invest pretty traditionally. They put their invested assets, saved assets, into the stock market, basically, and bond funds. The biggest holdings of most of our denominational investments would be Apple and Amazon and Google, Alphabet, Google's parent, Facebook. Often we've screened out sort of sin stocks, they might be called, like tobacco and things, weapons sometimes. There's some movement to screen out energy, fuel, gasoline, those sorts of things, oil companies. But by and large, we still put it in just the regular market. And the point generally is to try to generate as much money as possible, to get the highest return you can get, and then to turn around and use that money for mission. Some people have called that a two-pocket way of thinking. And out of one pocket, you invest and make money, and then out of the other pocket, you give money away. That model is okay to some extent, except that there are ways in which the actual invested capital funds, the original funds, can be used more strategically. So if in that scenario, what's happening is you might put in a pot of $1 million into an investment, and then you're only actually generating a small portion of return off of that every year that you're using for mission. The rest of the $1 million is sitting there being used by Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and all of these companies. They're using that money, your money, every second of every day to grow their business, to make the next Alexa device, to create the newest thumbs up, like button on Facebook. That's what they're using that money for. Yeah. And in exchange for that, they're paying you something back. There are places that we could use that money differently, right into the lives and the communities that we're trying to care about. So at Press House, we took an investment and we use that to offer unique student housing to students at the University of Wisconsin. And instead of that money being used by these companies, it's being used by a mission-oriented organization. That's what impact investing is, essentially, is using investment capital for direct impact, positive direct impact. And it can be everything from a simple, direct, small project, sort of like ours, to investing in a fund that does microfinance. It could be investing in clean energy or some other sort of thing where you want to move the needle, so to speak. One of the ideas that I'd really love to see is to see church entities take some of their assets and create funds that would invest in Black-owned businesses or Black-led nonprofits. The truth of the matter is a lot of our investment assets have ties to slavery and have ties to land that was taken from indigenous native people, and we don't recognize that very well. And one of the ways we could offer restitution for that is to actually take some of the money and put it to work in entrepreneurs of color, or in projects like that, rather than just giving it to Mark Zuckerberg or Google to use. So that's the idea of impact investing.
Yeah, those are great points. Talk about the kind of last question I want to ask you before we take a break here is, like, I know a church in my town that would be like a freaking perfect model for your kind of like property development as a way of doing ministry and also as like a revenue stream. I think the pastor has thought about it. I've heard him talk to me about it. What's your advice to like an ambitious pastor who's like, boy, I really would like to kind of go down this road, but I'm not, I don't have financial real estate experience. My board is like super, obviously the board's going to be somewhat behind it, but what's your advice to like a general, to that pastor?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Have you invited him to do an MBA with you? I guess to some extent I would say look for opportunities to learn outside of the traditional settings that we were trained in. I was trained traditionally at seminary, and many wonderful things about that experience, but many things were also missing from it. Learn about entrepreneurship. There's a lot of people that know a lot about it, actually. An MBA is not a bad idea, but it doesn't necessarily require doing a whole degree either to learn some of this stuff. I spent in my early years, I spent most of my continuing education time and money on nonprofit leadership courses and fundraising courses, business management courses, financial planning courses, those sorts of things, because those were things I needed to add to my skill deck that I didn't have coming out of seminary. One of the things we struggle with in the church is we often like to recreate the same thing that somebody else is doing, but do it worse. Yep. We don't need to. We don't need to. There's some really good stuff out there. The other thing, I'll do a plug for my organization, RootedGood. This is what we do. We provide resources and tools specifically for entrepreneurs, and many of them are used by faith-based entrepreneurs and churches. We have an accelerator course called Make Good, and it teaches you how to create new things. That's exactly what it's for. And so there are some excellent resources out there to get trained on. And then the other truth of the matter is, for all entrepreneurs anywhere, you just got to try stuff. Yeah. And it's not all going to work. Some of it's not going to work. If it's all working, you're not really trying anything, frankly. Because
what a great point.
Just give it a shot. Try something simple. Start with a small business idea and give it a go and see what you learn. And you learn more by doing that than in any degree program or course, just by trying something.
Don't say that because I'm halfway through my MBA, but you're probably right. I have to give a shout out to you here, Mark, to my own denomination. Disciples of Christ have a national benevolent association that they this is how I met Mark, was they have a social, I'm blanking on what it's called right now. They have a social entrepreneurship program. So check it out if you'd like to learn more about them. Let's take a break, Mark, and we'll come back with some closing questions.
Are you a worship leader who is going through a faith shift while still trying to produce 52 services a year? Are you a lead pastor who is dealing with high turnover on your creative team? Torn Curtain Arts exists to strengthen the creative soul of the local church by providing coaching, creative consulting, and interim worship leaders from our team with 20 years experience in the trenches of ministry. We help leaders get off the ministry treadmill of chasing Sunday after Sunday. Learn more about how we can help you and your team by visiting torncurtainarts.org.
All right, we're back with Reverend Mark Elsdon. And Mark, I always tell folks you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you like. So if you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do? What's that day look like?
Yeah, I think I said this earlier, but I would say it again. If I with regard to this topic, if I were Pope for the day, so to speak, I'd love to see Christian denominations immediately take 10% of that $400 billion of invested assets and set it aside as a below market rate investment fund for Black owned or Black led social businesses and nonprofits. I think it would be a powerful act of reparation. I think it would be a really impactful move. I mean, that would be huge sums of money that would flow into very different sectors, and in doing so, really focus on how to shift ownership and wealth from historically white institutions to a much more diverse set of people. It'd just be incredible to see what could happen if that was done. Even just 10% would be a fantastic move. Yeah.
Yeah. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
So the honest answer to this question is nobody. I'm not really interested actually in going back to the people that have gone before us have done incredible, wonderful things. So many of them, not all of them, so many of them. But I don't really feel the need to bring any of them back. I think we want to look forward and look ahead. Yeah.
What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Well, this is another huge question, but I think this moment that we've lived in the last year, one of the things that comes to mind is this question of white nationalism that has sort of become, I don't know how exactly, embedded in the American Christian faith in such a way that it, I think, jeopardizes its entire witness and existence as a Christian faith. So, how are we going to get through that? What are we going to do to move past that? To reclaim the message of Jesus and not of something that's totally unrecognizable as a Christian faith.
Yeah.
This year has been very difficult in that regard. So I'm hopeful that we can move beyond that.
Well, here's your question, Mark. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
I think I am hopeful that in many ways, as the church struggles, much of the church struggles with its relevancy, with its economics, with all of that it actually opens up more possibility for things to be done differently. Sometimes you have to basically have know where else to go before people are willing to do things differently and change. I do think that there is a really inspiring movement among young people in particular to live lives that are integrated, to be really have a powerful connection between what they do, what they say, what they believe, what they think, and how they live. So kind of returning all the way to the beginning of our conversation around what it means to live out the faith. I think there's an opportunity for that to happen in new and creative ways. I think it'd be great to see church be recovery communities and grocery co-ops and things that matter to people in their neighborhood. In addition to worship, for sure, but that we can be the church in the midst of the communities that we're in a way that is truly impactful and meaningful and meeting needs. I think there's enormous hope for that.
Awesome. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention, right? So, well, right. Tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and get the book.
So probably the best place is at my website, melsdon.com, MELSDON.com, and book is there, and there's a page of links to a lot of the other resources actually that we talked about today, and ways to reach me. So love to hear from folks.
Yeah, check it out. Mark, thanks for your time, and may God's peace be with you.
Thank you. Good to talk.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.